Carlos Castaneda's The Power of Silence, Chapter 1, The Manifestations of Spirit, Part 2, The Impeccability of the Naugal, Elias. I had no way of telling how long I slept in the cave. Don Juan's voice startled me and I awoke. He was saying that the first sorcery story concerning manifestations of the spirit was an account of the relationship between intent and the Naugal. It was the story of how the spirit set up a lure for the Naugal, a prospective disciple, and how the Naugal had to evaluate the lure before making his decision either to accept or reject it. It was very dark in the cave, and the small space was confining. Ordinarily, an area that size would have made me claustrophobic, but the cave kept soothing me, dispelling my feelings of annoyance. Also, something in the configuration of the cave absorbed the echoes of Don Juan's words. Don Juan explained that every act performed by sorcerers, especially by the Naugal, was either performed as a way to strengthen their link with intent or as a response triggered by the link itself. Sorcerers, and specifically the Naugals, therefore had to be actively and permanently on the lookout for manifestations of spirit. Such manifestations were called gestures of the spirit, or more simply, indications or omens. He repeated a story he had already told me, the story of how he had met his benefactor, the Naugal Julian. Don Juan had been cajoled by two crooked men to take a job on an isolated hacienda. One of the men, the foreman of the hacienda, simply took possession of Don Juan and in effect made him a slave. Desperate and with no other course of action, Don Juan escaped. The violent foreman chased him and caught him on a country road where he shot Don Juan in the chest and left him for dead. Don Juan was lying unconscious in the road, bleeding to death, when the Naugal Julian came along. Using his healer's knowledge, he stopped the bleeding, took Don Juan, who was still unconscious, home and cured him. The indications the spirit gave the Naugal Julian about Don Juan were, first, a small cyclone that lifted a cone of dust on the road a couple of yards from where he lay. The second omen was the thought which had crossed the Naugal Julian's mind an instant before he heard the report of the gun a few yards away, that it was time to have an apprentice Naugal. Moments later, the spirit gave him the third omen, when he ran to take cover and instead collided with the gunman, putting him to flight, and perhaps preventing him from shooting Don Juan a second time. A collision with someone was the type of blunder which no sorcerer, much less a Naugal, should ever make. The Naugal Julian immediately evaluated the opportunity. When he saw Don Juan, he understood the reason for the spirit's manifestations. Here was a double man, a perfect candidate to be his apprentice Naugal. This brought up a nagging rational concern for me. I wanted to know if sorcerers could interpret an omen erroneously. Don Juan replied that although my question sounded perfectly legitimate, it was inapplicable like the majority of my questions, because I asked them based on my experiences in the world of everyday life. Thus they were always about tested procedures, steps to be followed, and rules of meticulousness, but had nothing to do with the premises of sorcery. He pointed out that the flaw in my reasoning was that I always failed to include my experiences in the sorcerer's world. I argued that very few of my experiences in the sorcerer's world had continuity, and therefore I could not make use of those experiences in my present day-to-day life. Very few times, and only when I was in states of profound heightened awareness, had I remembered anything. At the level of the heightened awareness I usually reached, the only experience that had continuity between past and present was that of knowing him. He responded cuttingly that I was perfectly capable of engaging in sorcerer's reasonings because I had experienced the sorcery premise in my normal state of awareness. In a more mellow tone, he added that heightened awareness did not reveal everything until the whole edifice of sorcery knowledge was completed. He then answered my question about whether or not sorcerers could misinterpret omens. He explained that when a sorcerer interpreted an omen, he knew its exact meaning without having any notion of how he knew it. This was one of the bewildering effects of the connecting link with intent. Sorcerers had a sense of knowing things directly. How sure they were depended on the strength and clarity of their connection, their connecting link. He said that the feeling everyone knows as intuition is the activation of our link with intent. And since sorcerers deliberately pursue the understanding and strengthening of that link, it could be said that they intuit everything unerringly and accurately. Reading omens is commonplace for sorcerers. Mistakes happen only when personal feelings intervene and cloud the sorcerer's connecting link with intent. Otherwise, their direct knowledge is totally accurate and functional. We remained quiet for a while. All of a sudden he said, "I am going to tell you a story about the Naugal Elias and the manifestations of the Spirit. The Spirit manifests itself to a sorcerer, especially to a Naugal, at every turn. However, this is not the entire truth. The entire truth is that the Spirit reveals itself to everyone with the same intensity and consistency, but only sorcerers and Naugals in particular are attuned to such revelations." Don Juan began his story. He said that the Naugal Elias had been riding his horse to the city one day, taking him through a shortcut by some cornfields, when suddenly his horse shied, frightened by the low, fast sweep of a falcon that missed the Naugal's straw hat by only a few inches. The Naugal immediately dismounted and began to look around. He saw a strange young man among the tall, dry cornstalks. The man was dressed in an inexpensive dark suit and appeared alien there. The Naugal Elias was used to the sight of peasants and landowners in the fields, but he had never seen an elegantly dressed city man moving through the fields with apparent disregard for his expensive shoes and clothes. The Naugal tethered his horse and walked toward the young man. He recognized the flight of the falcon as well as the man's apparel as obvious manifestations of the Spirit, which he should not disregard. He got very close to the young man and saw what was going on. The man was chasing a peasant woman who was running a few yards ahead of him, dodging and laughing with him. The contradiction was quite apparent to the Naugal. The two people cavorting in the cornfield did not belong together. The Naugal thought that the man must be the landowner's son and the woman a servant in the house. He felt embarrassed to be observing them and was about to turn and leave when the falcon again swept over the cornfield and this time brushed the young man's head. The falcon alarmed the couple and they stopped and looked up, trying to anticipate another sweep. The Naugal noticed that the man was thin and handsome and had haunting, restless eyes. Then the couple became bored, watching for the falcon, and returned to their play. The man caught the woman, embraced her, and gently laid her on the ground. But instead of trying to make love to her, as the Naugal assumed he would do next, He removed his own clothes and paraded naked in front of the woman. She did not shyly close her eyes or scream with embarrassment or fright. She giggled, mesmerized by the prancing naked man, who moved around her like a satyr, making lewd gestures and laughing. Finally, apparently overpowered by the sight, she uttered a wild cry, rose, and threw herself into the young man's arms. Don Juan said that the Naugal Elias confessed to him that the indications of the spirit on that occasion had been most baffling. It was clearly evident that the man was insane. Otherwise, knowing how knowing how protective peasants were of their women, he would not have considered seducing a young peasant woman in broad daylight, a few yards from the road, and naked to boot. Don Juan broke into a laugh and told me that in those days to take off one's clothes and engage in a sexual act in broad daylight in such a place meant one had to be either insane or blessed by the spirit. He added that what the man had done might not seem remarkable nowadays, but then, nearly 100 years ago, people were infinitely more inhibited. All of this convinced the Naugal Elias that the moment he had laid eyes on the man, he was both insane and blessed by the spirit. He worried that peasants might happen by, become enraged, and lynch the man on the spot, but no one did. It felt to the Naugal as if time had been suspended. When the man finished making love, he put on his clothes, took out a handkerchief, meticulously dusted off his shoes, and all the while, making wild promises to the girl, went on his way. The Naugal Elias followed him. In fact, he followed him for several days and found out that his name was Julian and that he was an actor. Subsequently, the Naugal saw him on the stage often enough to realize that the actor had a great deal of charisma. The audience, especially the women, loved him, and he had no scruples about making use of his charismatic gifts to seduce female admirers. As the Naugal followed the actor, he was able to witness his seduction technique more than once. It entailed showing himself naked to his adoring fans as soon as he got them alone, then waiting until the woman, stunned by his display, surrendered. The technique seemed extremely effective for him. The Naugal had to admit that the actor was a great success, except on one count. He was mortally ill. The Naugal had seen the black shadow of death that followed him everywhere. Don Juan explained again something he had told me years before, that our death was a black spot right behind the left shoulder. He said that sorcerers knew when a person was close to dying because they could see the dark spot, which became a moving shadow, the exact size and shape of the person to whom it belonged. As he recognized the imminent presence of death, the Naugal was plunged into a numbing perplexity. He wondered why the spirit was singling out such a sick person. He had been taught that in a natural state, replacement, not repair, prevailed, and the Naugal doubted that he had the ability or the strength to heal this young man or resist the black shadow of his death. He even doubted if he would be able to discover why the spirit had involved him in a display of such obvious waste. Naugal could do nothing but stay with the actor, follow him around, and wait for the opportunity to see in greater depth. Don Juan explained that a Naugal's first reaction upon being faced with the manifestations of the spirit is to see the persons involved. The Naugal Elias had been meticulous about seeing the man the moment he laid eyes on him. He had also seen the peasant woman, who was part of the spirit's manifestation, but he had seen nothing that, in his judgment, could have warranted the spirit's display. In the course of witnessing another seduction, however, the Naugal ability to see took on a new depth. This time the actor's adoring fan was the daughter of a rich landowner. And from the start, she was in complete control. The narwhal found out about their rendezvous because he overheard her daring the actor to meet her the next day. The narwhal was hiding across the street at dawn when the young woman left her house, and instead of going to early mass, she went to join the actor. The actor was waiting for her, and she coaxed him into following her to the open fields. He appeared to hesitate, but she taunted him and would not allow him to withdraw. As the narwhal watched them sneaking away, he had an absolute conviction that something was going to happen on that day, which neither of the players was anticipating. He saw that the actor's black shadow had grown to almost twice his height. The narwhal deduced from the mysterious hard look in the young woman's eyes that she too had felt the black shadow of death at an intuitive level. The actor seemed preoccupied. He did not laugh as he had on other occasions. They walked quite a distance. At one point they spotted the narwhal following them, but he instantly pretended to be working the land, a peasant who belonged there. That made the couple relax and allowed the narwhal to come closer. Then the moment came when the actor tossed off his clothes and showed himself to the girl. But instead of swooning and falling into his arms as the other conquest had, this girl began to hit him. She kicked and punched him mercilessly and stepped on his bare toes, making him cry out with pain. The narwhal knew the man had not threatened or harmed the young woman. He had not laid a finger on her. She was the only one fighting. He was merely trying to parry the blows and persistently, but without enthusiasm, trying to entice her by showing her his genitals. The narwhal was filled with both revulsion and admiration. He could perceive that the actor was an irredeemable libertine, but he could also perceive equally easily that there was something unique, although revolting, about him. It baffled the narwhal to see that the man's connecting link with spirit was extraordinarily clear. Finally, the attack ended. The woman stopped beating the actor. But then, instead of running away, she surrendered, lay down, and told the actor he could now have his way with her. The narwhal observed that the man was so exhausted he was practically unconscious. Yet despite his fatigue, he went right ahead and consummated his seduction. The narwhal was laughing and pondering that useless man's great stamina and determination when the woman screamed and the actor began to gasp. The narwhal saw how the black shadow struck the actor. It went like a dagger, with pinpoint accuracy, into his gap. Don Juan made a digression at this point to elaborate on something he had explained before. He had described the gap, an opening in our luminous shell, at the height of the navel, where the force of death ceaselessly struck. What Don Juan now explained was, when death hit healthy beings, it was like a ball-like blow. It was a ball-like blow, like the punch of a fist. But when beings were dying, death struck them like a dagger, like a thrust. Thus, the narwhal Elias knew, without any hesitation, that the actor was as good as dead, and his death automatically finished his own interest in the spirit's designs. There were no designs left. Death had leveled everything. He rose from his hiding place and started to leave when something made him hesitate. It was the young woman's calmness. She nonchalantly, putting on a few pieces of clothing she had taken off, and was whistling tunelessly as if nothing had happened. And then the narwhal saw that in relaxing to accept the presence of death, the man's body had released a protecting veil and revealed his true nature. He was a double man of tremendous resources, capable of creating a screen for protection or disguise, a natural sorcerer, and a perfect candidate for a Naugal apprentice, had it not been for the black shadow of death. The Naugal was completely taken aback by the sight. He now understood the designs of the spirit, but failed to comprehend how such a useless man could fit in the sorcerer's scheme of things. The woman, in the meantime, had stood up, and without so much as a glance at the man, whose body was contorting with the death spasms, walked away. The Naugal then saw her luminosity and realized that her extreme aggressiveness was the result of an enormous flow of superfluous energy. He became convinced that if she did not put that energy to sober use, it would get the best of her, and there was no telling what misfortunes would cause her. As the Naugal watched the unconcern with which she walked away, he realized that Spirit had given him another manifestation. He needed to be calm, nonchalant. He needed to act as if he had nothing to lose and intervene for the hell of it. In the true Naugal fashion, he decided to tackle the impossible, with no one except the Spirit as his witness. Don Juan commented that it took incidents like this to test whether a Naugal is the real thing or a fake. Nawals make decisions with no regard for the consequences. They take action or choose not to. Impostors ponder and become paralyzed. The Naugal Elias, having made his decision, walked calmly to the side of the dying man and did the first thing his body, not his mind, compelled him to do. He struck the man's assemblage point to cause him to enter into heightened awareness. He struck him frantically, again and again, until his assemblage point moved. Aided by the force of death itself, the Naugal's blows sent the man's assemblage point to a place where death no longer mattered, and there he stopped dying. By the time the actor was breathing again, the Naugal had become aware of the magnitude of his responsibility. If the man was to fend off the force of his death, it would be necessary for him to remain in deep, heightened awareness until death had been repelled. The man's advanced physical deterioration meant he could not be moved from the spot, or he would instantly die. The Naugal did the only thing possible under the circumstances. He built a shack around the body. There, for 3 months, he nursed the totally immobilized man. My rational thoughts took over, and instead of just listening, I wanted to know how the Naugal Elias could build a shack on someone else's land. I was aware of the rural people's passion about land ownership and its accompanying feelings of territoriality. Don Juan admitted that he had asked the same question himself, and the Naugal Elias had said that the Spirit itself had made it possible. This was the case with everything a Naugal undertook, providing he followed the Spirit's manifestations. The first thing the Naugal Elias did when the actor was breathing again was to run after the young woman. She was an important part of Spirit's manifestation. He caught up with her not too far from the spot where the actor lay barely alive. Rather than talking to her about the man's plight and trying to convince her to help him, he again assumed total responsibility for his actions and jumped on her like a lion, striking her assemblage point a mighty blow. Both she and the actor were capable of sustaining life or death blows. Her assemblage point moved, but began to shift erratically once it was loose. The Naugal carried the young woman to where the actor lay. Then he spent the entire day trying to keep her from losing her mind and the man from losing his life. When he was fairly certain he had a degree of control, he went to the woman's father and told him that lightning must have struck his daughter and made her temporarily mad. He took the father where she lay and said that the young man, whoever he was, had taken the whole charge of the lightning with his body, thus saving the girl from certain death. but injuring himself to the point where he could not be moved. The grateful father helped the Naugal build a shack for the man who had saved his daughter, and in 3 months the Naugal accomplished the impossible. He healed the young man. When the time came for the Naugal to leave, his sense of responsibility and his duty required him both to warn the young woman about her excess energy and the injurious consequences it could have on her life and well-being, and to ask her to join the sorcerer's world, as that would be the only defense against her self-destructive strength. The woman did not respond, and the Naugal Elias was obliged to tell her what every Naugal has said to a prospective apprentice throughout the ages, that sorcerers speak of sorcery as a magical, mysterious bird which has paused in its flight for a moment in order to give man hope and purpose. That sorcerers live under the wing of that bird, which they call the bird of wisdom, the bird of freedom. That they nourish it with their dedication and impeccability. He told her that sorcerers knew the flight of the bird of freedom was always a straight line, since it had no way of making a loop, no way of circling back and returning, and that the bird of freedom could do only 2 things: take sorcerers along or leave them behind. The Naugal Elias could not talk to the young actor, who was still mortally ill, in the same way. The young man did not have much of a choice. Still, the Naugal told him that if he wanted to be cured, he would have to follow the Naugal unconditionally. The actor accepted the terms instantly. The day the Naugal Elias and the actor started back home, the young woman was waiting silently at the edge of town. She arrived, no suitcases, not even a basket. She seemed to have come merely to see them off. The Naugal kept walking without looking at her, but the actor, being carried on a stretcher, strained to say goodbye to her. She laughed and wordlessly merged into the Naugal's party. She had no doubts and no problem about leaving everything behind. She had understood perfectly that there was no second chance for her, that the bird of freedom either took sorcerers along or left them behind. Don Juan commented that was not surprising. The force of the Naugal's personality was always so overwhelming that he was practically irresistible, and the Naugal Elias had affected those 2 people deeply. He had had 3 months of daily interaction to accustom them to his consistency, his detachment, his objectivity. They had become enchanted by his sobriety and, above all, by his total dedication to them. Through his example and his actions, the Naugal Elias had given them a sustained view of the sorcerer's world, supportive, nurturing, yet utterly demanding. It was a world that admitted very few mistakes. Don Juan reminded me then of something he had repeated to me often, but which I had always managed not to think about. He said that I would not forget even for an instant that the bird of freedom had very little patience with indecision, and when it flew away, it never returned. The chilling resonance of his voice made the surroundings, which only a second before had been peacefully dark, burst with immediacy. Don Juan summoned the peaceful darkness back as fast as he had summoned urgency. He punched me lightly on the arm. That woman was so powerful that she could dance circles around anyone, he said. Her name was Talitha.